A billionaire CEO hosting a prestigious business expo spots his ex-wife of 7 months at the job fair next door, accompanied. Annoyed at first to see her with another man, he freezes in shock when he sees her baby bump. Nathan Kingsley stood in the center of the grand hall, the cacophony of the business expo buzzing around him like a swarm of bees. Booths lined the expansive space, draped with sleek banners and glittering displays of innovation. He had attended dozens of these events in his career, but today, he was restless. His assistant had carefully curated his itinerary, networking with tech innovators, a keynote speech, and scouting potential recruits. Yet, his mind wasn't in the game. He adjusted his cufflinks, scanning the crowd with an air of detached confidence. His tailored suit screamed power and success, and yet, for all his wealth and status, he felt a nagging emptiness he couldn't shake. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. There was no time for introspection. His empire demanded his full attention. As he turned toward a promising display of cutting-edge AI software, his gaze snagged on something, or rather someone, that made his breath catch. Clara. She was standing near the job fair section of the hall, her hand brushing over her swollen belly. Her unmistakable laugh floated above the noise, lighting up the space around her. She looked radiant, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with a happiness he hadn't seen in a long time. A man stood close beside her, his arm resting casually on the small of her back. He leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh again. Nathan froze, his heart pounding like a drum. For a moment, the noise of the expo faded into silence, and all he could hear was the rush of his own pulse. She was pregnant. Clara was pregnant. And she was with someone else. His mind struggled to catch up. 7 months. It had only been 7 months since their divorce was finalized. 7 months since she had walked out of their penthouse, leaving behind a short, handwritten note on the marble kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore, Nathan. I hope you understand someday." He hadn't understood then, and seeing her now, smiling, glowing, and seemingly thriving without him, only deepened the ache he had buried beneath layers of work and distraction. His initial shock gave way to a tangle of emotions: jealousy, confusion, guilt. The man beside her reached out, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. It was an intimate gesture, one that spoke of familiarity and care. Nathan felt an unexpected surge of anger rise in his chest. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Was this why she had left? Had she already found someone else? Or had she been with this man while they were still married? The questions swirled in his mind, each more bitter than the last. But then his gaze shifted to her belly, and a different thought struck him, one that stopped his breath entirely. The baby? Could it be his? He quickly did the math. Their marriage had ended in April, but they'd had a brief, tentative reconciliation attempt in late March, a weekend of raw emotion and vulnerability that had felt, at the time, like a fragile bridge over a growing chasm. Could that weekend have resulted in this? He felt the ground beneath him tilt, a sickening wave of realization washing over him. His legs moved before his brain caught up, carrying him closer to the job fair section. He had to know. He had to ask her. He couldn't just stand there, frozen, while his ex-wife, his Clara, shared this intimate moment with another man. As he approached, he noticed more details. The way her smile softened when she looked at the man, the way her hand absent-mindedly rested on her belly as she spoke. She seemed happy. Truly happy. And that happiness cut through Nathan like a knife. It wasn't that he didn't want her to be happy, he did. But why hadn't she been happy with him? He had given her everything, a luxurious life, financial security, the best of everything. Yet none of it had been enough. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of himself. What was he going to say? What could he say? His mind raced with potential opening lines, but every one of them sounded inadequate. Before he could decide, the man beside Clara leaned in closer, murmuring something in her ear. She laughed softly, tilting her head toward him. And then he placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers brushing against her collarbone with an intimacy that made Nathan's stomach churn. That simple gesture stopped him in his tracks. Nathan's chest tightened, a familiar mix of anger and helplessness bubbling up. He clenched his jaw, his fists still curled at his sides. He wasn't sure if he was angrier at the man for touching her or at himself for not being the man she turned to anymore. He hesitated, torn between the urge to confront her and the fear of what he might discover if he did. What if the baby wasn't his? What if this man was more than just a placeholder? What if Clara had truly moved on and found the happiness she had never felt with him? Nathan took a step back, his mind swirling with unanswered questions and a pain he thought he had buried. The noise of the expo returned, loud and jarring, as if the world had snapped back into focus. He shoved his hands into his pockets, retreating to the shadows of the bustling hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He would approach her, but not now. Not like this. He needed to think, to process, to figure out what he wanted to say. But one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away from this. Not again. As he turned to leave, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. Clara's laughter rang out, a sound that haunted him as he walked away. The man's hand still rested on her shoulder, a quiet claim that Nathan couldn't ignore. And for the first time in years, Nathan Kingsley, billionaire, tech mogul, and master of control, felt completely powerless. Nathan sat in the back seat of his car, staring out the tinted window as the bustling streets of the city passed by in a blur. His driver, sensing his unusual silence, refrained from making small talk. Nathan's mind was elsewhere, still stuck at the expo, still replaying the image of Clara's radiant smile and the way that man had touched her. He gritted his teeth, his fingers drumming against the leather seat. The questions gnawed at him, insistent and unrelenting. Was it his child? And if it was, why hadn't she told him? How had things come to this point? He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, but the memories surged forward, unbidden. Their romance had been electric, a whirlwind that had taken both of them by surprise. Clara had been unlike anyone he'd ever met, sharp, driven, unafraid to challenge him in ways that others never dared. She'd called him out on his arrogance, made him laugh when he'd forgotten how, and for a while, she'd made him believe that love could coexist with his relentless ambition. But that ambition had been their undoing. He remembered the nights she'd waited up for him, her patience eroding with each unanswered text. The arguments that had started as whispers and escalated into shouting matches. Her tearful pleas for him to set boundaries at work, to carve out time for her, for them. And he remembered the look in her eyes the night she'd left, the mix of sorrow and resignation, as if she'd already mourned the end of their marriage long before it had officially crumbled. He thought he could fix it, that she just needed space. But weeks turned into months, and neither of them had reached out to bridge the widening gap. Now here she was, pregnant and with another man. The realization burned, but beneath the anger and confusion, there was something else, a flicker of hope, fragile but insistent. If the baby was his, it wasn't too late to make things right. Was it? The car pulled up to his penthouse, but Nathan barely noticed. Instead of heading inside, he gave his driver new instructions. Take him back to the expo. By the time he returned, the crowd had thinned, and the job fair section was quieter. His heart pounded as he scanned the room, searching for her. Then, just as he was beginning to think she'd left, he saw her. Clara stood near a table, flipping through a pamphlet, her brow furrowed in concentration. The man, Mark, as Nathan would soon learn, was nowhere in sight. He hesitated, his palms damp. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he walked over. "Clara," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. She looked up, startled. For a brief moment, her expression softened, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a wary guardedness. "Nathan," she said, her tone cool. "This is unexpected. I didn't know you'd be here," he replied, searching her face for any hint of the warmth they once shared. "I didn't know you were." His eyes flicked to her belly, and the words caught in his throat. "Pregnant?" she finished for him, her lips pressing into a thin line. Yes, well, life moves on. Her words were a slap, but Nathan held his ground. Can we talk? She hesitated, glancing around the room as if weighing her options. Finally, she gestured toward an empty table in the corner. Fine. But make it quick. They sat across from each other, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara's fingers traced the edge of her water bottle, while Nathan struggled to find the right words. You look good, he said finally, the compliment sounding hollow even to his own ears. She raised an eyebrow. Let's skip the small talk, Nathan. What do you want? He took a deep breath, deciding there was no point in dancing around the issue. Is it mine? Clara's expression hardened. Is what yours? The baby, Clara. Is the baby mine? Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, he thought she might get up and walk away. But then she sighed, leaning back in her chair. I don't see how that's any of your business. His jaw tightened. It's my business if it's my child. She met his gaze, her own eyes unreadable. And what if it is? What difference does it make now? You made your priorities clear, Nathan. This, she gestured toward her belly, isn't something you can just swoop in and fix with a grand gesture or a check? That's not fair, he said, his voice low. I didn't know. And whose fault is that? She shot back, her voice trembling. You were always too busy, too focused on your empire to notice anything that didn't fit into your perfect little schedule. Her words stung, but he didn't deny them. Instead, he said quietly, I made mistakes. I know that. But if this is my child, I deserve to know. Don't I? Clara looked away, her fingers tightening around the bottle. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Nathan. The baby is yours. The words hit him like a freight train, equal parts relief and regret. He leaned forward, his voice urgent. Then let me help. Let me be there for you, for both of you. Clara shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. You think it's that simple? That you can just walk back into my life and play the hero? It doesn't work like that. I'm not trying to be a hero, he said, his voice cracking. I just want to make things right. Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. Everything okay here? Nathan turned to see Mark approaching, his expression cautious but firm. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, and she relaxed slightly under his touch. This is Mark, she said, her tone pointed. He's been helping me through this transition. Nathan's eyes narrowed. Helping? In what way? Mark raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting Clara answer. As a friend, Nathan. Nothing more. Her words eased some of the tension in Nathan's chest, but the sight of Mark standing so protectively beside her still made his stomach churn. Nathan rose to his feet, forcing himself to remain calm. We're not done talking, he said to Clara, his gaze steady. I'll give you space, but we need to figure this out. Clara didn't respond, her expression unreadable as Nathan turned and walked away. As he left the expo, his mind raced with everything he hadn't said. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing. He wasn't going to lose Clara, or their child, without a fight. Nathan sat at his desk, staring blankly at the towering windows of his penthouse office. The city stretched out below, bustling with life, but he felt disconnected, as if he were watching the world from behind a pane of glass. The revelation from Clara had left him shaken, and his emotions were a tangle of anger, regret, and something dangerously close to hope. The baby was his. She'd admitted it, but her guarded demeanor and the presence of Mark left him with more questions than answers. Why hadn't she told him sooner? Had she truly intended to cut him out of their child's life? And what was Mark's role in all of this? Nathan clenched his fists. He couldn't stop replaying their conversation, analyzing every word, every expression. Clara had been so defensive, so adamant that he couldn't just waltz back into her life. But didn't he have a right to be there? To know his child? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, Margaret, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with him since the early days of his company. She had an uncanny ability to sense when he needed something, often before he even realized it himself. "Margaret," he said, his voice clipped. "I need you to do something for me." There was a brief pause. "Of course. What do you need?" Nathan hesitated, grappling with the morality of what he was about to ask. But the need for answers outweighed his discomfort. "I need you to find out everything you can about Clara's life since the divorce. Where she's living, her work, everything." Margaret didn't question him. She never did. "Consider it done." He hung up, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't his proudest moment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Clara had always been independent, fiercely so. For her to move on so quickly, or to have kept something so monumental from him, felt out of character. He needed to know why. The next 24 hours were a blur. Nathan threw himself into work, trying to distract himself, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. He pictured her standing at the expo, her hand on her belly, her laughter ringing in his ears. She seemed happy, content, and that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. By the following evening, Margaret had delivered. "Nathan," she said, stepping into his office with her tablet in hand, "I've compiled everything you asked for. Let's hear it," he said, bracing himself. Margaret took a seat across from him, her expression professional but tinged with curiosity. After the divorce, Clara moved out of the penthouse and into a modest apartment in Midtown. It's a significant downgrade from what she was used to, but she seems to have settled in well. She left her position at the marketing firm shortly after the split. Nathan frowned. She left her job? Why? Margaret hesitated. It's unclear. But I did find something interesting. She's been attending prenatal classes at a community center nearby. Alone. His chest tightened at the thought of Clara going through this by herself. What about the man? Mark? Mark Weller, Margaret said, swiping her tablet. He's a childhood friend of Clara's. Works as a physical therapist. There's no indication of a romantic relationship between them. It seems he's just helping her out during the pregnancy. Nathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. At least that piece of the puzzle made sense. But something still didn't add up. Margaret continued. One more thing. Based on the timeline of Clara's pregnancy, it likely started around late March or early April. Nathan's heart stopped. Late March. That was when they'd had their brief reconciliation, a weekend filled with raw honesty and fleeting hope. It had been the last time they'd shared any semblance of intimacy before the divorce became final. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no doubt now. The baby was his. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts. Nathan, are you all right? He nodded, though his mind was spinning. I'm fine. Thank you, Margaret. That'll be all. As she left, Nathan sank back into his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Clara had known all along. She had to have known. And yet, she hadn't told him. She'd chosen to go through this alone, to leave him in the dark. A surge of anger coursed through him, but it was quickly tempered by guilt. Hadn't he driven her to this? He'd been so consumed by his work, so blind to her needs, that she'd felt she had no choice but to walk away. But this wasn't just about him and Clara anymore. There was a child involved, a child who deserved to know his or her father. And Nathan wasn't going to stand by and let Clara shut him out. He picked up his phone, dialing her number before he could second-guess himself. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Clara, it's Nathan, he said, his voice firm but calm. We need to talk. Properly this time. Call me back. He hung up, staring at the phone as if willing it to ring. When it didn't, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had always been his playground, his battleground. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. Not about his ability to succeed or his place in the world, but about the people who mattered most. He'd built an empire, but it had cost him the one thing he couldn't replace. And now, with a child on the way, he had a chance to rebuild. To make things right. The question was whether Clara would let him. Nathan stared at his phone, still waiting for Clara's call. It had been 2 days since he'd left the voicemail, and her silence was eating at him. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, an apology? A willingness to talk things through? Or perhaps just acknowledgement of the truth that now bound them together? Instead, there was nothing. Only the quiet void of unanswered questions. He decided to take matters into his own hands. If Clara wouldn't come to him, he'd create a reason for her to meet him. Pulling up his assistant Margaret's number, he gave her simple instructions: draft an invitation for Clara to meet with him, framed as a professional opportunity. Clara had always been ambitious. If she thought there was a career move involved, she might be more inclined to come. Margaret, as always, delivered. A few hours later, Nathan's phone buzzed with confirmation. Clara had agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe downtown. Relief and tension coiled together in his chest. This was his chance to get the answers he needed, and to finally confront her about the pregnancy. The cafe was intimate, tucked away from the city's chaos. Nathan arrived early, choosing a corner table where they wouldn't be interrupted. He tried to keep his nerves at bay, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with his coffee cup as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. When Clara walked in, she was dressed in a soft, flowing dress that accentuated her growing belly. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked every bit as composed as she had the day they met. Yet, there was a guardedness in her eyes, a wariness that told him she wasn't here to indulge his questions. "Nathan," she said, sitting across from him. Her tone was neutral, but her posture stiff. "Clara." He offered a small, tentative smile, but she didn't return it. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward, until he broke it. "Thank you for meeting me. You said it was about a job opportunity," she replied, her voice clipped. "So, what is it?" Nathan took a deep breath, deciding there was no point in skirting the issue. "That was just a way to get you here. I need to talk to you, Clara. About us. About the baby." Her jaw tightened, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I don't see what there is to talk about." "There's everything to talk about," he said, leaning forward. "You're carrying my child, Clara. Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes narrowed, her voice cold. "Because I didn't think it mattered to you." Nathan flinched, the words hitting harder than he'd expected. "How can you say that?" "Of course, it matters to me. You matter to me," she scoffed, shaking her head. "Don't pretend this is about me, Nathan. This is about your ego. You can't stand the idea of not being in control, not knowing everything. But you didn't care about us when it mattered. That's not fair." He shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I made mistakes, yes, but I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't bother to look," she interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I waited for you, Nathan. I waited for you to notice how unhappy I was, how much I needed you. But you were too busy building your empire to see it." The rawness in her voice stunned him into silence. For a moment, he could only stare at her, taking in the pain etched into her features. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you," she continued, her tone softening but still laced with hurt. "You have your life, your priorities. I wasn't going to tie you down with something you didn't want." Nathan's heart twisted. "You think I wouldn't want this? That I wouldn't want to be a father?" She looked away, her eyes glistening. "You've never been one to slow down, Nathan. A child doesn't fit into your world." He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't see it then, Clara. I was blind, and I'm sorry. But I see it now. I see what I lost, what I've been losing this whole time." Clara shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple. You can't just say sorry and expect everything to fall into place." "I don't expect that," he said quickly. "I know I have a lot to prove, and I will. But I'm not letting you push me away. Not now, not when there's so much at stake." She looked back at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "You weren't there when I needed you, Nathan. And Mark. He stepped up. He's been my rock through all of this. Nathan's stomach twisted at the mention of Mark. Is there something between you two? He asked, his voice tight. Clara's brow furrowed, and she let out a sigh. No, Nathan. Mark is a friend. That's all. But he's been more present for me than you ever were. The accusation stung, but Nathan couldn't argue. You're right, he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. I wasn't there for you when I should have been. And I hate that it took losing you to realize what I had. But I'm here now, Clara. I want to be part of this, part of our child's life. Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. I don't know if I can trust you, Nathan. Not with something this important. He leaned forward, his gaze earnest. I'll earn your trust back. I'll do whatever it takes. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Clara looked down at her hands, then back up at him. This isn't just about you, Nathan. It's about what's best for the baby. If you're serious about being involved, you need to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. Nathan nodded, his resolve solidifying. I will. I promise. Clara exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. We'll see. It wasn't the resolution he'd hoped for, but it was a start. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had a long way to go, but he wasn't going to let that deter him. This was his chance to make things right, and he wouldn't squander it. As Clara stood to leave, Nathan watched her go, a mix of determination and longing swirling in his chest. Their story wasn't over, not yet. And he was determined to write a better chapter. Nathan couldn't shake the conversation with Clara. Her words echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of how much he'd failed her. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could fight for their future, for his child's future. The following days were a blur of reflection and planning. Nathan knew he couldn't simply declare his intentions and expect Clara to believe him. He needed to show her that he was serious, that he was willing to do the work. But how? He barely knew where to start. He spent hours researching parenting, attending workshops discreetly, and speaking with colleagues who were fathers. It wasn't his natural terrain, but he threw himself into it with the same intensity he brought to his work. If he was going to prove himself to Clara, he needed to understand what this role truly entailed. Still, despite his efforts, there was a lingering fear that Clara wouldn't let him in. She'd been so resolute, so sure that he couldn't fit into the life she was building. And if she truly believed that, how could he convince her otherwise? His opportunity came a week later when Margaret informed him that Clara had agreed to another meeting. This time, it wasn't a professional guise, he'd asked her directly. Clara had hesitated but eventually said yes. They met in a park near her apartment. The setting was casual, intentionally so. Nathan wanted to avoid the sterile formality of boardrooms or the intimidating opulence of his penthouse. He needed Clara to see him as more than the billionaire CEO, more than the man she'd grown to resent. Clara arrived, her expression cautious but calm. She wore a light jacket over her growing belly, her hair loosely tied back. She looked beautiful, though Nathan knew better than to say it aloud. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, breaking the silence as she approached. I wasn't sure either, she replied, her tone measured. But I figured I should hear what you have to say. Nathan gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, he began. I know I wasn't there for you when it mattered, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But this isn't about guilt, Clara. It's about wanting to be the father our child deserves. Clara's brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what about me? Do you want to be part of my life, or is this just about the baby? Nathan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I want to be part of both, he said finally. But I know I have to earn that. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I'm asking for a chance to prove I've changed. Clara folded her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. You've had chances before, Nathan. You always said you'd make time, that things would be different. But they never were. Why should I believe you now? Because I've learned what it means to lose you, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And I don't want to lose our child too. Her lips tightened, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on a group of children playing nearby. You talk about change, but I'm not sure you understand what that means. It's not about showing up now because you feel guilty. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't fit into your schedule. I understand that, Nathan said, leaning forward. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes, Clara. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. Is everything okay here? They both turned to see Mark standing a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. Nathan's jaw tightened instinctively, but he forced himself to remain calm. We're talking, Clara said, her tone slightly defensive. It's fine. Mark nodded, his eyes flicking between them before settling on Clara. I just wanted to check. Do you want me to stay? Nathan bristled, but Clara shook her head. It's okay, Mark. Thank you. Mark hesitated, then stepped closer, addressing Nathan directly. I'm not trying to interfere, but Clara's been through a lot. If you're here just to make yourself feel better, I suggest you leave her alone. Nathan stood, meeting Mark's gaze. I'm not here for myself, he said evenly. I'm here because I want to be there for my child, and for Clara. Mark studied him for a moment, then looked back at Clara. You know how I feel about this. It's your decision, but don't shut him out just because you're afraid. He deserves the chance to show you he can step up. Clara blinked, clearly taken aback. Mark, I'm just saying. Mark interrupted gently. He's the father, Clara. And I'm not trying to replace him. I never was. Nathan's chest tightened at the unexpected support. He hadn't expected Mark to take his side, and he couldn't deny the relief that came with it. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. You're not making this any easier, you know. Mark offered a small smile. It's not supposed to be easy. With that, he gave Nathan a brief nod and walked away, leaving them alone again. Clara turned back to Nathan, her expression conflicted. You're lucky he's so understanding. I don't take that for granted, Nathan said. But this isn't about Mark. It's about us. About our child. Please, Clara. Give me the chance to prove I can be the man you need me to be. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting to the playground again. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, less guarded. I don't know if I can trust you, Nathan. But maybe I owe it to our child to try. Relief flooded through him, but he kept his emotions in check. That's all I'm asking for. Clara nodded slowly, though her eyes remained wary. This doesn't mean I'm letting you back into my life, not completely. But we can start small. See where it goes. Nathan nodded, his heart swelling with hope. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Nathan left the park feeling cautiously optimistic. Clara had agreed to let him try, no promises, no guarantees, but it was a step forward. He knew he couldn't rely on words alone. If he wanted to be part of their lives, he needed to show her that he was capable of change. The next morning, he made a decision that startled even his assistant. Margaret, he said as she entered his office with the day's agenda. I need you to clear my evenings for the next month. No exceptions. Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You're rescheduling the investor dinner next week? Yes, he replied firmly. And delegate anything that doesn't require my direct attention. My focus needs to shift for a while. She studied him, her expression softening. This about Clara? Nathan nodded. And the baby. I can't let work consume me anymore, Margaret. Not when it means losing what matters most. Margaret didn't question him further, simply nodded and left the room. For Nathan, this was uncharted territory. Work had always been his safe space, the one thing he could control. Letting go of even a fraction of it felt like stepping into a void, but he knew it was necessary. Over the next few weeks, he made an effort to be present in Clara's life. He attended her doctor's appointments, often sitting quietly in the corner, as the obstetrician explained what to expect in the coming months. He asked questions, took notes, and made sure Clara knew he was there to support her. At first, she was hesitant, her guard firmly in place. But over time, Nathan saw glimpses of the Clara he remembered, the way her eyes softened when he offered to carry her groceries, the faint smile that tugged at her lips when he nervously fumbled through assembling a crib. He didn't push her for more, content to let her set the pace. But Clara wasn't without her struggles. Every time she felt herself beginning to trust Nathan again, a voice in her head warned her to tread carefully. Her heart remembered the pain of being left behind, of watching him prioritize his empire over their marriage. She confided in her friends and, reluctantly, in Mark. "I don't know if he's really changed," she admitted one afternoon as they sat in her living room. "What if this is just a phase? What if he goes back to his old ways once the baby is born?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's a risk," he acknowledged. "But he's trying, Clara. And from what I've seen, he's serious about this. Maybe it's worth giving him the chance to prove it." Her friends echoed similar sentiments, urging her to consider that Nathan might genuinely be different this time. Clara wasn't sure if she was ready to fully believe it, but she couldn't deny that his actions had begun to chip away at her doubts. The turning point came on a cold evening in late October. Clara had reluctantly agreed to attend a charity gala hosted by one of her friends, despite feeling tired and irritable. Nathan had offered to accompany her, but she declined, insisting she could manage on her own. The event was bustling, filled with laughter and chatter, but Clara felt out of place. She was halfway through a conversation with a former colleague when a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly, and the room seemed to tilt. "Clara, are you okay?" someone asked, but she could barely focus. The pain intensified, and she felt a sudden rush of panic. It was too soon. Her due date was still weeks away. She managed to mumble something about needing help, and before she knew it, Mark was by her side. He'd been at the event as well and immediately took charge, helping her to a nearby chair. But when Clara's breathing grew ragged and her face paled, he made a decision. "I'm calling Nathan," he said firmly. "No," Clara protested weakly, but Mark ignored her, pulling out his phone. Nathan answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with concern as Mark quickly explained the situation. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Nathan said, already grabbing his coat. True to his word, Nathan arrived at the gala just as Clara was being helped toward the exit. His face was a mixture of fear and determination as he rushed to her side, taking her hand in his. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We'll get through this together." The ride to the hospital was a blur. Nathan stayed by Clara's side, holding her hand and whispering reassurances as the contractions grew stronger. Her initial resistance melted away, replaced by a mix of pain and gratitude for his presence. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, the cries of a newborn filled the room. Clara's exhaustion gave way to a wave of relief and joy as the nurse placed their son in her arms. She looked up at Nathan, who was staring at the baby with an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of awe, love, and vulnerability. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling. "His name is Liam." Nathan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "He's perfect." For a moment, the three of them existed in a world separate from everything else. It was raw and fragile, but it was theirs. As Clara watched Nathan gently cradle their son, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to acknowledge in months: hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that Nathan might truly be capable of change, and that their broken bond might one day be whole again. The days following Liam's birth were a whirlwind. Clara had been discharged from the hospital with a flurry of instructions and advice from nurses, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of caring for a newborn. Sleep became a luxury, and her world revolved around feedings, diaper changes, and fleeting moments of rest. Through it all, Nathan was there. He wasn't just present, he was engaged. He learned how to swaddle Liam, how to soothe him when he cried, and even how to master the dreaded diaper changes. Watching him with their son stirred something in Clara. This was a side of Nathan she'd never seen before, patient, attentive, and utterly devoted. One evening, as Clara sat in the nursery rocking Liam to sleep, she glanced at Nathan, who was carefully assembling a mobile over the crib. His face was a mix of concentration and pride, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a flicker of warmth toward him that wasn't clouded by resentment. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Nathan looked up, startled, then smiled. "I'm learning as I go. I didn't want to mess up the mobile. It's supposed to help him sleep, right?" Clara chuckled. "That's the idea." They shared a rare moment of quiet laughter, and for a brief second, it felt like the walls between them had started to crack. As the days turned into weeks, Nathan's commitment never wavered. He'd cut his work hours significantly, dedicating his mornings and evenings entirely to Clara and Liam. It didn't go unnoticed by Clara, who had grown used to the Nathan who was married to his job. This Nathan was different, and she couldn't deny that it stirred something within her. One night, after Liam had finally drifted off, Clara found herself sitting with Nathan in the living room. The air was filled with the faint hum of the baby monitor, and the exhaustion that usually weighed on her felt momentarily lighter. "Nathan," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything." He set down his coffee cup, his full attention on her. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I was so angry with you for so long. Angry that you didn't see me, that I always felt like I was competing with your work. And when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd see it as an inconvenience." Nathan's face fell, guilt etched into his features. "Clara, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I didn't think you'd want this life. I thought you'd resent me for disrupting everything you'd built. So I made the decision to keep you out of it." Nathan's eyes glistened, but he stayed silent, letting her speak. "But seeing you with Liam..." Her voice cracked, and she paused, taking a shaky breath. "You've proven me wrong. You're here. You're trying. And I'm starting to believe that maybe you've really changed." Nathan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I have, Clara. Losing you was the wake-up call I didn't realize I needed. I know I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I promise you, I will never take you or our family for granted again." Tears welled in her eyes, and she didn't pull her hand away. "I want to believe you, Nathan. I really do." "Then let me show you," he said earnestly. "Day by day, I'll prove it." Their conversation felt like a step forward, a tentative bridge over the chasm that had separated them. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in months, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. A few days later, Mark stopped by to visit. He brought a gift for Liam, a soft blue blanket embroidered with his name, and spent a few minutes cooing over the baby. But Clara could sense there was something on his mind. When Nathan left the room to grab more coffee, Mark turned to Clara, his expression kind but serious. "You seem lighter," he said, nodding toward the door where Nathan had just exited. "Happier." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm still figuring things out. But I think we might be okay. Eventually." Mark nodded, his eyes warm. "Good. That's all I ever wanted, for you to be happy. You've done so much for me, Mark," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how I would have gotten through these past few months without you." He waved her words away, though his smile was tinged with bittersweet emotion. "You don't need me anymore, Clara. Not in the way you did." Nathan stepping up, "And that's how it should be." Clara's heart clenched. "You'll always be part of my life, you know. You're like family." Mark nodded, his smile softening. "I know. But it's time for me to step back, let you and Nathan figure things out. You deserve the chance to rebuild your family. Clara blinked back tears as Mark stood, pulling her into a gentle hug. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. He pulled back, his smile unwavering. Take care of yourself, and that little guy. And don't let Nathan off the hook too easily. Nathan re-entered the room as Mark was leaving. The two men exchanged a brief nod, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Nathan didn't need to ask what had been said. He could see the gratitude and resolution in Clara's eyes. Later that evening, as Nathan rocked Liam to sleep, Clara watched from the doorway, her heart full. She couldn't predict the future, but for the first time, she felt ready to try. Nathan had shown her that change was possible, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn to trust him again. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges. But as Nathan kissed Liam's forehead and whispered promises of love and protection, Clara allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. For now, that was enough. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm. Nathan had fully integrated himself into Liam's world, becoming the kind of father Clara hadn't dared to imagine he could be. Late-night feedings, early morning diaper changes, and even the occasional meltdown, Nathan was there for it all. His dedication softened Clara's heart further, but the scars of their past still lingered, a quiet reminder of the risks of letting him in too deeply. Clara had cautiously begun to trust Nathan again, though she remained careful to keep her guard up. Their relationship had shifted, from tense exchanges to comfortable co-parenting, and she appreciated the effort he made to respect her boundaries. Yet, in unguarded moments, she caught herself watching him with Liam, her heart swelling with emotions she tried to suppress. Nathan noticed these moments too, the fleeting looks, the softening of her expression when she thought he wasn't paying attention. It gave him hope, but he didn't push her. He knew rebuilding what they had would take time, and he was willing to wait. One crisp afternoon in early spring, Nathan asked Clara to join him and Liam at the park. Clara hesitated at first. Nathan had been planning more outings lately, and she couldn't help but wonder if he had something up his sleeve. But Liam's excited cooing as Nathan bundled him into his stroller melted her resistance, and she agreed. The park was alive with the sounds of children playing, the scent of blooming flowers drifting on the breeze. Nathan led them to a quiet spot near a small pond, where a picnic blanket was already spread out. Clara raised an eyebrow as she sat down, her suspicion growing. "You've been planning this," she said, her tone light but curious. Nathan grinned, unbothered by her skepticism. "Maybe a little. I thought it'd be nice to spend the afternoon together, just the three of us." Clara shook her head, unable to suppress a smile. Liam gurgled happily in her lap, his tiny fingers grasping at her hair, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan grew uncharacteristically quiet. Clara noticed his thoughtful expression and leaned back against the tree, her curiosity piqued. "Okay, what's going on? You've been acting weird." Nathan took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he turned to face her. "There's something I've been meaning to say. Or ask." Clara's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. "Nathan, if this is about, just hear me out," he interrupted gently. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, unassuming box. Clara froze, her breath catching as he opened it to reveal a simple silver bracelet engraved with Liam's initials. "This isn't a proposal," Nathan said quickly, his voice earnest. "At least, not the kind you might think. I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. I know we're not there, and I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for." Clara exhaled, relief and confusion mingling in her chest. "Then what is this?" Nathan shifted closer, his eyes meeting hers. "This is me asking you to let us start over. Not as husband and wife, not even as a couple if you're not ready for that. But as two people who love their son and care about each other. Let me be part of your life again, Clara, step by step, no pressure, no expectations. Just us. A new beginning." Clara's throat tightened, emotion welling up as she stared at the bracelet. It was simple, thoughtful, and completely unexpected. For all of Nathan's grand gestures in the past, this one felt different. It wasn't about impressing her or winning her over, it was about meeting her where she was, with no strings attached. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said softly. "Not to forever, not to anything you're not ready for. Just to the possibility that we can build something better than what we had before." Clara looked down at Liam, who was now dozing peacefully in her arms, his tiny face the picture of serenity. Her heart swelled as she thought about everything they'd been through, the pain, the distance, the tentative steps toward healing. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to take a chance. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "But on one condition." Nathan's eyebrows lifted. "Name it." "Honesty," she said firmly. "No more hiding, no more brushing things under the rug. If we're doing this, we do it right." Nathan nodded, his expression serious. "Agreed. No more hiding." He slid the bracelet onto her wrist, his fingers brushing against her skin. The gesture was small but intimate, and Clara felt a flicker of warmth spread through her chest. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. Liam stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and Nathan reached over to pick him up, cradling him against his chest. The sight made Clara's heart ache in the best way. "Should we get a picture?" Nathan suggested, glancing at her with a smile. "Liam's first day at the park deserves to be documented." Clara rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress her grin. "Fine. But only if you don't make it some big production." Nathan laughed, pulling out his phone. He handed it to a passing jogger, who happily agreed to snap the photo. Clara scooted closer, her shoulder brushing against Nathan's as she smiled down at Liam. The jogger counted down, and as the camera clicked, Clara found herself genuinely smiling. It wasn't forced or guarded, it was real, a moment of joy captured in time. Later that evening, as Clara tucked Liam into his crib, she glanced at the photo Nathan had sent her. The three of them looked happy. Maybe not perfect, but something close to it. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that happiness wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was something they could build together, one step at a time. Part 9: Building the Future. The weeks following their renewed commitment were both challenging and rewarding. Clara and Nathan settled into a rhythm that was different from anything they'd known before, one built on mutual respect, patience, and above all, honesty. It wasn't always easy. Old habits and fears still surfaced, but this time, they faced them together. Nathan had fully embraced his role as a father, juggling his responsibilities at work with the demands of raising a newborn. To Clara's surprise, he was flourishing. He'd taken to leaving his phone in another room during their time together, a small but significant gesture that showed her how seriously he was taking his promise to prioritize family. Clara, in turn, began to let her guard down. She'd been so used to carrying the burden alone, and it took time to adjust to having someone share it. But with Nathan by her side, she started to feel lighter, more confident that she wasn't in this alone. One evening, after they'd put Liam to bed, Clara found herself sitting with Nathan in the living room. They were surrounded by baby toys and an empty bottle on the coffee table, a far cry from the sleek, polished life they'd once shared. And yet, she felt content. "Do you ever think about how different things are now?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Nathan looked up from the book he was reading, his expression thoughtful. "All the time. But honestly, I wouldn't change it." She raised an eyebrow. "Not even the late-night diaper changes?" He chuckled, setting the book aside. "Not even those. It's messy and it's hard, but it feels real. I spent so many years chasing something I thought would make me happy, and now I realize I was looking in the wrong place." Clara leaned back, her heart warming at his words. "You've changed a lot, Nathan." "So have you," he said, his voice soft. "You've always been strong, but now, you seem more at peace." Clara smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I think I'm finally starting to trust that we can do this. That we can make it work. Nathan reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. We can. And we will. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a soft cry from Liam's room. Clara moved to get up, but Nathan stopped her with a gentle touch. I've got it, he said, standing. You relax? She watched him disappear down the hallway, a smile tugging at her lips. This was their new normal, imperfect but filled with love. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt certain they were on the right path. A few weeks later, Nathan surprised her again, this time with a proposal of a different kind. They were sitting in the park where he'd first asked her to start over, watching Liam try to crawl on the blankets spread out before them. I've been thinking, Nathan said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. About what's next for us. Clara glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. I don't want to rush anything. I know we're still rebuilding, but I want us to be a family. Not just for Liam, but for us. Clara's heart skipped a beat. We already are a family, Nathan. I know, he said, his smile soft. But I want it to be official. Not just co-parents who happen to care about each other. I want us to try again, not just as parents but as partners. Clara's breath caught, her emotions swirling. Nathan. No pressure, he added quickly. You don't have to decide now. But I want you to know how serious I am about this. About us. She looked at him, at the man who had worked so hard to prove himself, and felt the weight of his sincerity. The fear that had held her back for so long began to fade, replaced by a tentative hope. Let's keep taking it one step at a time, she said finally, her voice steady. But I think I'd like that. Nathan's smile lit up his face, and he reached out to squeeze her hand. That's all I could ask for. As Liam let out a delighted squeal, the two of them laughed, leaning into each other as they watched their son explore the world around him. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for Clara and Nathan, that was more than enough. As the sun sets on this heartfelt story, we're reminded that love and family aren't about perfection, they're about growth, forgiveness, and the courage to start over. Nathan and Clara's journey shows us that even the most broken bonds can be mended with patience, effort, and a shared commitment to what truly matters. So, what do you think? Can people really change, and can relationships find their way back after falling apart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of love, resilience, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark the soul. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.